Jane was 10 years old and had been living with her mother's sister at a large, cold house in the north of England for as long as she could remember. Her parents were both dead. Her aunt did not like her. Her 3 cousins did not like her. She was fed and clothed and permitted to sit in a corner of the sitting room in the evenings. And beyond that, she was not much noticed by anyone in the house, except when one of the cousins wished to punish her for a small thing she had not done. She was, for these reasons, quietly relieved when her aunt announced, on the morning of her 11th birthday, that she was to be sent away to a school for orphans in a small, remote valley many miles from the house. The school was called Lode. It was a hard place. The rooms were cold. The food was thin. The teachers were, for the most part, tired women who had learned to be strict as a defense against caring too much. Jane made one true friend at Lode, a warm, quiet girl named Helen who read from a small, dark book in the evenings, and who explained to Jane, gently, that the world was very often cruel to small girls, and that the only reply worth making to that cruelty was kindness. Helen died of a small, slow illness in the spring of Jane's 2nd year at the school, in Jane's own arms, in the small, dark hour before dawn. Jane carried her friend's small, warm hand in her own memory for the rest of her long life. Jane stayed at Lode for 8 years. She was a good student. She became, at 16, a small, careful teacher of the younger girls. She stayed in this position for 2 years, and then, when she was 18 and had begun to feel the small, quiet weight of the walls of the valley on her small, quiet shoulders, she placed an advertisement in a local paper offering her services as a governess. And she received, within 3 weeks, a warm letter offering her a position at a large old country house called Thornwood Hall. The mistress of the house was a small, warm, elderly widow named Mrs. Fairfax, who received Jane at the front door and showed her kindly to a small, clean room on the 1st floor. The child Jane was to teach was a small, pretty French girl of about 7 named Adele, who was the ward of the house's owner. The owner himself, a man named Mr. Rothwell, was, Mrs. Fairfax said gently, away from home most of the time on business and could not always be expected to appear. Jane began her small, careful work with Adele. She grew, over the following weeks, to love the small, warm rhythm of the house. She walked in the small, dark gardens in the evenings. She read in the library at night. She had, for the first time in her life, a small, quiet room of her own, and a small, warm friend in Mrs. Fairfax, and a small pupil who seemed pleased when she came into the room. It was a warm autumn afternoon 3 months after her arrival, when she first met Mr. Rothwell. She was walking a small country lane near the house when a horse and rider came suddenly around the corner. The horse startled. The rider fell. Jane, without thinking, helped him up. He was a tall, dark man of perhaps 40, with a hard, weather-beaten face and small, careful eyes that watched her from the first moment as though she were something new. He asked her, without pleasantries, who she was. She said she was the governess at Thornwood Hall. He nodded once. He asked her to help him back onto the horse. He rode away without saying his own name. She learned that evening from Mrs. Fairfax that the man on the horse had been Mr. Rothwell. He stayed at Thornwood for the next several weeks. He asked one evening that Jane be brought to the drawing-room after Adele had been put to bed. She sat opposite him. He asked her small, careful questions about her life, her schooling, her opinions on a number of small, serious subjects. She answered him honestly. She was not afraid of him, though most people, she gathered, were. He was, she saw very quickly, not entirely a comfortable man. But she saw also that he was a warmer man than he had learned to appear. Over the following months they became friends. Their conversations grew longer. He began to walk with her sometimes in the gardens. He began to speak in careful small pieces of his own small, heavy life. He had been forced into a marriage in his youth. His wife had gone mad. She had been dead to him in every sense that mattered for many years, though the law would not release him from her. He did not say more than that. Jane did not ask. There were, in that autumn and winter, several strange incidents at the house. One night Jane woke to the smell of smoke and found Mr. Rothwell's bed on fire. She put it out with water from her own washing bowl. He seemed, when she woke him, more shaken than the small fire warranted. He would not say, when she asked, who might have started it. Some months later, a small guest of the house was attacked in his own room by an unseen assailant who bit him on the neck and disappeared before help could arrive. Jane, who nursed the guest through that night at Mr. Rothwell's request, saw enough to understand that whatever was in that house was not entirely a servant, and not entirely well. Mr. Rothwell asked her to marry him in the small garden on a warm evening in early summer. She said yes. She had loved him quietly for many months. The wedding was to be small. It was held on a warm summer morning in the small stone church at the edge of the estate. Halfway through the ceremony, a stranger from London stood up at the back of the church and announced, in a small, clear voice, that Mr. Rothwell had a wife already, and that she was, at that moment, alive and living in the very house Jane had believed to be her home. He named her. He named the small English lawyer who had brought her from the West Indies. He produced a small paper certificate. Mr. Rothwell did not deny it. He led the whole wedding party back to Thornwood. He climbed the small, dark staircase to the 3rd floor. He unlocked a small, heavy door that Jane had never seen open at the far end of a corridor she had never walked. Inside, on a bed at the far end of a small, dim room, sat a woman with wild hair and hard eyes. She was Mr. Rothwell's first wife, a woman named Bertha, mad for many years, kept in that room under the care of a small paid servant for as long as she had a mind to think or a body to keep alive. Jane looked at the small, terrible woman for a long moment. She looked at Mr. Rothwell. She said nothing. She went to her own room. She packed a small bag. She left the house before dawn the next morning. She wandered for 3 days on the small English moors with almost no money and no clear plan. She grew weak. She grew hungry. She reached, on the 3rd night, a small, warm house in a small, remote village where she collapsed at the door. She was taken in by a warm sister and brother, a young clergyman named John Rivers and his kind sister Diana, who did not know at first who she was. They discovered, some weeks later by a small, quiet coincidence, that Jane was in fact their own cousin, and that a small uncle of hers had recently died and left her a small, warm fortune. Jane divided this fortune equally between herself and the Rivers cousins, over their small, warm protests, because she had learned already that money kept for oneself made a smaller, warm life than money shared. John Rivers, the clergyman, asked her, at the end of that year, to marry him and to come with him to India as a missionary's wife. He did not love her in the way she wished to be loved. He respected her in his cold, serious way and thought she would make a good wife for the work. Jane thought about it for many weeks. She almost agreed. She was very tired and had begun to think that the small, warm love she had once wanted would never come again. Then one night, sitting by an open window in her small, quiet cousin's house, she heard, on the wind or in her own mind, a small, warm voice calling her name from very far away. It was Mr. Rothwell's voice. She was, in that small, clear moment, certain of it. She rose the next morning and traveled back to Thornwood Hall. She arrived to find the great old house burned to the ground. She learned from a small, warm innkeeper in the nearby village that Bertha had set the fire herself many months earlier, that Mr. Rothwell had rescued every servant in the house, one by one, and had climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor to save even Bertha, who had, in the small, mad end, thrown herself from the roof. He had been struck by falling wood as he climbed down. He had lost the sight of both eyes and the use of one hand. Jane rode that afternoon to the small, quiet estate where he had gone to live in his blindness. She found him sitting alone on a small stone bench in the garden. She spoke his name. He turned toward her voice, not yet believing. She married him within a month. He regained, over the following years, the sight of one eye enough to see the small, warm face of his wife each morning, and the small, round face of their first son when he was born. Jane, who had once been the small, unloved orphan of a large, cold house in the north, became the warm center of a small, quiet home that she and her husband kept